Okay, welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us at the Future of Finance as we move from ESG and sustainability towards impact. I'm Cliff Pryor, I'm CEO of the GSG Impact, supporting impact development across countries with capital mobilization and impact transparency. We have an excellent panel with us, James Payne, Nathan Cole, Mahima Sukhdev, Elsa Powell and Ben Constable Maxwell, and I'll introduce them in just a few minutes. But first of all, let's set the scene. So, hopefully, there we go. One more to work. Okay, so to set the scene, the future of finance and investment is developing really rapidly. The UK has been a leader in the fields of ESG and sustainability framed investments, delivering crucial funds for climate mitigation and adaptation and resilience. But change is coming. Tough new rules around ESG, taxonomies, regulatory reporting requirements, new regulations around the EU, around USA, and I'm just back from China, new regulations from China too and Japan, many more jurisdictions. In accounting, the International Sustainability Standards Board is setting out harmonised global standards. Impact valuation is in development, and it all adds up to a new world order of finance, a world order which should benefit action on climate, recognising also the issues on families and livelihoods as well. So, how will we plan for the new financial system? What challenges can be expected in the changes that are involved? What steps are we making from ESG and sustainability towards impact? And what are you going to do in your company to put yourself into the forefront of these changes? So let's hear now from our panel. First of all, James.
Just briefly introduce ourselves, is it? Yeah, great. Hello, everyone. I'm James Payne. I'm the global head of our work on the purpose of business and society at Forum for the Future. So the enabling context for business is a really big focus for us. So in particular, our School of System Change for Finance, which we deliver in partnership with Viva Investors, big focus, I guess, for this panel.
Thank you. Nathan.
Hi everyone, Nathan Cole, CDP's Head of Sustainable Business. I focus on our work streams around sustainable finance, sustainable procurement, including SMEs, and also focus on our plastics work.
Hi everyone, my name is Mahima Sukhdev. I'm the Senior Vice President of Commercial Development at Just Impact, and Just Impact is a leading impact data and analytics provider. We work with some of the world's largest banks, asset owners, multinational companies to help them measure and quantify their impact on society and the environment. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you, and to Ben.
Hi everyone, Ben Constable Maxwell. I'm Head of Impact Strategy at M&G Investments, and we are a large mainstream investor, but orienting, I think, increasingly towards impact investing as a core to our sustainable investing strategy more broadly. My role is to support the business in our transition towards impact investing.
Thank you very much. Elsa.
Hi, my name is Elsa Powell. I'm the founder and CEO of Blue Onion. We're headquartered in Hong Kong. We address the entire financial ecosystem, sustainability performances, all the way from the supply chain to the asset managers to the distributors, the banks, and also the end users. Currently, we have 42,000 companies globally on the platform and rolling up to 300,000 mutual funds and ETFs. So it's very robust.
Thank you very much indeed. So let's start with the basics. ESG moving towards impact. And James, so why do you see this as important? Why are we putting so much effort into reporting and standards?
Thanks, Cliff. I think on reporting and standards, I think what's it's easy to lose sight of. I mean, they're so important, but it's so easy to lose sight of around why we're doing it. Like, what is the reason for it? Why are we putting so much focus on it? And at Forum for the Future, we have a really big focus on system change, and data and standards are a key enabler of driving the wider, deeper, more transformative systemic change we need in our economic system and in the way that business operates. We've got a 9-lever framework for strategies for system change, and 2 of them relate to data and standards. One is around how data is shared freely and fairly, and that can really kind of unlock and seed change. And then the other is around when we're trying to kind of lock in a new system and a better way of doing things, having the right standards and measures are a key way of doing that. So it's really about sort of understanding how we can move beyond just a very narrow sort of view of short-term profit maximization and financial value measurements into having really robust, sound ways of measuring the broader contribution the business can make to society and the environment.
Thanks very much. And Nathan, what's the problem then with ESG?
Yeah, great question. And honestly, I would reframe the question a little bit. I don't think there is strictly a problem with ESG as a concept. I think the problem is more in the definitions, in the methods, in the harmonization, in the space. And you're really right, James. It's about providing a cohesive framework, but the right framework as well. And I think to date, we haven't quite landed on that framework. That's why you see these broad moves going from mandatory TCFD up to ISSB, recognizing the science and what's required. But I think, thinking more practically about financial services companies as well, there's, a lack of harmonization in how those assessments of portfolios and understanding portfolio impact is being done, with only, 23% using externally classified methods to sort their products and services when they disclose to CDP. So there's clearly a huge swathe of companies who are doing their own thing on their own terms. And if we could see greater unification, harmonization across that, I don't think there would be such a problem with ESG.
Okay, I've got to come back to you because you had 2 acronyms there, TCFD and
Task
ISSB.
Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and the other one?
ISSB.
ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, who just released an updated methodology. They're building on TCFD as great groundwork. Sorry.
That's great, thank you. Mahima, at GIST, you consider impact valuation. What's that about?
That is also a very good question. So picking up on something James said there, he mentioned what we're trying to do is target systems change. And I think one thing we need to acknowledge is that we all live in and work in and practice in a capitalist society where we make decisions based on financial values and monetary values. So impact valuation in a nutshell is just speaking sustainability in the language of finance. So if you're a sustainability leader, you're going into your CFO's office, you've got all of your sustainability data in front of you, your tons of CO2 and gallons of water and the number of apprentices you've trained. That data is going to land on mostly deaf ears and is not going to be integrated into decision making unless it's converted into the language of finance. Because they have on that CFO's table, they have their quarterly reports. That's all dollar values or pound values in front of it. It's standardized, it's audited. And when push comes to shove, they will still make their decisions based on that financial data. And so impact valuation converts all of the sustainability data we're talking about here using peer-reviewed science and economics into financial values that basically business leaders and investors can start to make sense of and make decisions around in the way that they're used to, right? ROI, trade-offs, hidden risks, materiality, all of the ways in which they can use financial data, they can then do that with sustainability data.
That's fantastic, thank you. So Ben, you're an investor in a mainstream asset management firm. How do you see the change from ESG to impact in that situation?
Yeah, I mean, it's an important shift that's taking place, as we said at the start, and I think there are the tools and the methodologies that are helping us in that direction. But I think what the shift from ESG to impact really does is it helps you really think about your investments and the problems that your investments are trying to tackle in an entirely different way. So, using another buzzword, double materiality, which is thinking about how relevant a sustainability issue is to the company, but also how relevant that company is in affecting real-world outcomes on social and environmental challenges. I think impact investing really orients you towards more of a holistic picture, not just thinking about the risks of the company, but what the risks and opportunities that company faces in tackling major global societal challenges. And I think the other angle is that it helps us think about risk and opportunity in an entirely different way. It really drives us towards, I think, companies that are positioned for a future economy, that are companies that are really tackling the world's problems rather than contributing to those challenges. And I think ESG is really about trying to reduce the negative role that companies can have on contributing to climate change, contributing to pollution, contributing to social inequalities, for example, whereas impact really is about investing in, supporting, helping to scale those solutions. And I think it's a completely different perspective, frankly, and I think it's the way that really financial and capital markets were set up to help try and solve problems, and I think impact investing starts to bring us back towards that sort of perspective and mentality, which I think is much needed if we're going to tackle the challenges that we face in any effective way.
Thanks, and that's it's an interesting view on it, that actually impact is really where we used to be. We just went away for a while and now we're coming back. So Elsa, at Blue Onion, you expose quality and sustainability for asset managers. What's this quality piece? What's that?
You use the word expose, okay. Yes, so I think, first of all, I have a lot of sympathy on the asset managers, and most of them I don't think had the intention to greenwash. Everyone has the intention to build a good quality portfolio. And building on what Ben just mentioned, I think there's a very important difference between avoiding negative impact and also driving positive impact. So which is why we like the SFDR framework a little bit better. I wouldn't say it's better, but it's by far it is the more quantifiable framework. So one can be looking at the principal adverse impact indicators where you stand on creating externality and impact for the world. While you're cleaning your house, you're actually sweeping your dirt outside. That doesn't sound too right. At the same time, when you're driving proactive impact, you are facilitating some sort of transition from brown to green. So the Article 9 would help us look clearer into the quality of the constituent of companies the asset managers are incorporating. So that is quite important to have that kind of clarity so that the asset managers won't be accused of greenwashing, thereby either divesting or underweighting on companies that are not aligned with the overall objectives. So I think that's important, and also for the users, for the banks at the same time, to have the same measurements to look at the asset managers, using the same level of clarity and transparency. Therefore, everyone can be aligned and there's no more greenwashing activities. That would be a wonderful world.
Thank you. And you had one acronym as well. I think it was SFDR?
The Sustainability Financial Disclosure Regulation.
Absolutely, absolutely. One of the things that I've learned over the years about this entire area is that if you don't have a 4-letter acronym, you're nothing. This is the important thing to have. So we've just been hearing the differences between ESG and impact. But what happens when we start to get beyond carbon? So James, so we're now doing more and more reporting on data, yet there's a feeling that it's still not sufficient. Why so?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, we've probably never had more data around this area, and I think so much, we really need to bring a huge amount of discernment to the data that we're capturing and how we're using it, because I think the question from my perspective is all this data and all of this reporting actually driving change, or is it just reinforcing the status quo? And I think having the discernment to be able to sort of differentiate between that is absolutely key. So often, data can just be used to sort of slightly refine or slightly optimize the current system. And actually, when you step back and look at what's needed, a much more transformational approach is needed to stay within planetary boundaries and to address the kind of inequality crisis we face. So I think there is that huge risk. I think the other huge risk is that we just focus on what we can measure. So, I'm sure there's been a lot of talk around carbon tunnel vision, but we just see so often people just zooming in on, they're able to measure their carbon footprint. So that's the only thing they're focusing on, and all of these other hugely negative impacts or huge opportunities being missed. So I think particularly looking at impacts on health of the business, impacts on society, impacts on nature, really, we need a much smarter joined up approach from business, looking to maximize co-benefits across these, hugely interconnected issues. So I think there's just something about really having that discernment, and also to have that discernment to be looking at other signals. So I think there's a danger in an over-reliance on quant data. We do need, business people make decisions all the time in a volatile context with a mix of quantitative and qualitative data. And I think there needs to be leadership from business to step up. And, we're never going to have perfect data, particularly on social metrics. So there needs to be values-based leadership. There needs to be, that mix, an intelligent mix of qual and quant data to sort of understand if that deeper change is happening.
Just briefly, what you said there, it's never going to be perfect for the social side. Why?
I think it's just sort of, how do you value a life? What financial value do you put on a life? I mean, there's huge ethical issues here, and I think it does come back to this sort of the idea that the economy and our financial system kind of operates in a vacuum. Our economy is embedded in a society which is embedded in a geosphere that we all depend upon, and as human beings, we are values-led human beings. And I think, obviously, it's great to have good data. It's great to sort of make evidence-based decisions. But we also need to recognize that, that there are certain areas that ultimately no spreadsheet is going to make the decision for you.
Thank you. And Nathan, so we have more disclosure, we have more data. What does it mean for the real economy?
Well, I think we've already seen a lot of elements where this data is already permeating the real economy. And, even just on CDP's self-disclosed data, 80% of financial services companies are incorporating these ESG considerations into their due diligence and risk assessment processes. They are using primary emissions data for their engagement. They are actively incorporating this data into their decision-making as we speak. I think the question, as you rightly point out, is, what is the appropriate data, and is that being collected in the right way? And I think there is this hesitation, you're right, around, we often say on these panels, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. And I think sometimes there's this hesitation around imperfect data, when the reality is it's never going to be quite right. Take Scope 3, for example. It is fundamentally a bit of a finger in the air exercise of estimating, and you need to get comfortable with that. And I think there is that tension more broadly. So no, I think the data is already being used. There's a question around, what is the ongoing useful data points? How are we receiving that? How are we enabling the provision of that data to inform these decision useful moments? Because fundamentally, data for the sake of data serves no one. So I think we need to speak to the folks using the data and understand what is being used, how is that needing to be calculated, and then perhaps there's a bit of a moment to think about what is being put into this ESG system, because I don't think ESG or data collection at its core is a problem. It's around how it's expressed and how that interacts with other standards and elements. And as I say, everyone's doing their own thing with a slightly varied approach, but you speak to any financial services company who's making these judgments, making these investments, they'll have 5 to 10 KPIs, data points that they really need to understand, need to be able to assess the transition plan, need to understand understand the direction of travel on X, on Y. And these are the key elements, and it's moving beyond just this overarching rating or score indicating a company is good or bad in a binary definition into let me see these indicators and understand more practically what's happening under the hood. And that's about direction of travel, and it's about a conversation. And I think that's where we need to get to, is that closer understanding of what's actually being used on the ground.
Okay, now you mentioned scope 3. Explain scope 3.
Sorry, yes. So scope 1 emissions, direct operations. This is what you put out into the world by creating things. Scope 2 is emissions from your electricity usage. Scope 3 are all the intangible emissions that come from, say, use of your products and services, business travel. Crucially for financial services companies, there is the category 15 investments, looking at portfolio emissions, i.e. what emissions come from the investments being made as well. But yeah, apologies.
No, it's good. It's good. There's lots of learning here. And can I just suggest for all of us, when we're speaking, do keep the microphone close to your mouth, because otherwise it's a little bit quiet there. Mahima, so we're looking beyond carbon now. What other areas would you say are important for consideration?
Yeah, so we absolutely must look beyond carbon. That's key. Because we can't build a net zero world where we have most of our animal and plant species extinct and our agricultural systems collapsed and we're plagued by disease. So absolutely we must look beyond carbon. I think to the points that were both James and Nathan have mentioned, we do need to take an double materiality lens and specifically look at impact materiality so that we're not boiling the ocean on data points that we're collecting and then starting to, you've got your hand up, go ahead.
Materiality explain.
Materiality explain. So materiality is it's kind of what it says on the tin. It's what's material to your company, i.e. what should you be paying attention to, or if you're an investor, which aspects of your portfolio should you be focusing in on, what's where there is risk and or opportunity. And so when we talk about double materiality, to just quickly spend a minute on that, it means there's an outside-in perspective. So the ways in which the environmental issues and social issues are going to affect your company's bottom line. And then there's the inside-out, which is the impact materiality, which is the ways in which your company's operations and activities are impacting society and the environment. That may or may not, probably will in the long term, come back into financial materiality. So it is a little bit of a loop. But the concept of double materiality sort of brought to the fore really by CSRD, another acronym. Don't ask me to define it. It's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, if I'm right. That becomes really, really important when we move from carbon to other data points. And if I can just make a quick plug, like what comes next after carbon, I really do believe that nature and biodiversity needs to be the next big thing that we hit. Just because, A, there's momentum behind it. We've had the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework aligned on 2 years ago. Last year, the Task Force for Nature-Related Disclosures, TNFD, published their recommendations, and there's a lot of reporting and standard sort of momentum, but then also it's an extremely urgent topic, and Ben, we've talked about this previously. If you look at the latest planetary boundaries and you look at biosphere integrity, that is shooting out off the charts in a way that even climate change isn't. So we do need to pay attention to this. $44 trillion of the global GDP, which is half of all the world's GDP a year, is related to or dependent on nature and nature-related services. So if that's not material, to go back to that point that we talked about, to investors and to corporates, then I don't know what is. And the good news is there are companies who like ours, who provide nature and biodiversity-related data that is easy to incorporate into decision-making for both investors and for corporates. So we're getting there, but the world is not going to wait for us to solve one problem at a time. We can't go to carbon first, put a bow on it, then go to nature next. We do need to address them concurrently.
And by nature, are you looking on land and on oceans?
Everything, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, 80% of our planet is water, so we cannot ignore marine biodiversity and oceans.
Technically, nature incorporates climate as well, so
this
it really
is true.
is everything.
There's a strong connection, absolutely.
Yeah. I'm going to jump across to Elsa now. Can we achieve good quality of the data that we now have? If we're expanding from carbon to nature and other areas, can we still get good quality?
Again, I think people are focusing too much on the quality of data. Data is data, right? And coming from an asset manager's perspective, I think it's important for an asset manager to, for example, conduct site visits, do their due diligence on using engagement practices and voting against something that's very unreasonable, like what Elon Musk is trying to do, billions of dollars of compensation. So there are many material topics under social and governance. So at Blue Onion, we don't just look at ESG, we call it sustainability now. We take the financial into consideration as well. And honestly, sometimes if you look at data quality, right? So how data is being extracted or collected, typically you have your ARs and your SR, your annual reporting and your sustainability reporting. But then you also should be focusing on the news metrics. So no company is going to voluntarily tell you they're mistreating someone or they're not taking care of their customers. So you need to drill down to different platforms and forums to see what third parties are looking at. So would you call that accurate? Sometimes, right? You always have bad levers. You always have disgruntled employees trying to make a big deal out of something. But at the end of the day, when an asset manager looks at these data, it's really their responsibilities to go on site. If it happens too often, from noise to becoming a signal, then it's something that needs to be alerted. The asset owners and the investors needs to be alerted. Then actions should be taken. So in other words, we should not always sit around and wait and ask, how accurate is your data? Well, the carbon, same thing, right? We need to look beyond carbon, but carbon is still arguable, right? Only Nathan has the best data quality. Nobody else has the best data quality. So, it depends. So we like PCAF because it's using 5 different level of quality scores to see how data is being extracted and estimated. Inevitably, we have to be doing estimation. So social is something that we need to see it for ourselves, I would say. And governance is easier. It's on the annual report. And whether or not the asset owner would take the opportunity to vote against a chairman, CEO being the same person, those kind of things, it's time for us to take action rather than sitting around and waiting for what quality is, what data is, quality is the best.
Actually, if I can just a further question. I mean, obviously here in this conference, we mainly in UK, maybe a bit of EU here. Your work primarily in Asia?
Well, we're everywhere. We cover companies globally, 42,000 companies globally, and the 300,000 funds are also global funds and ETFs. We haven't integrated the U.S. domestic funds because there's a lot and it's too domestic. It's going to kill my AWS bills. So no, we don't have that yet, but we can easily plug that in. So it's global.
What level of understanding and integration of this kind of work in Asia? Or is it very different in different countries around Asia?
Asia is very money focused. So we're currently relying on regulation being the primary driver. And it's doing its work. So for example, recently our Hong Kong Monetary Authority came out with a circular demanding all the banks who are selling and distributing ESG-focused funds must have their own due diligence process and methodology. They should not rely on what the asset managers tell them, and they should not even rely on what the SFC has labeled. So in a way, it's pushing Asia forward, but the banks were about to give up because it's too difficult.
Interesting. Yeah, the reason why I ask it is that Asia is, 63% of the population. So whenever we're looking at what's happening, whether it's on carbon or nature or other areas, we have to always remember that actually the big deal is in Asia, and that's why I was asking it. So can I just take a quick show of hands? Do people now? Are people confident that we should shift from ESG towards impact, that impact is where we should be looking. I see one hand, quite a lot of hands, quite a few hands. How about people who feel, no, we should stay with ESG. We're getting too complicated if we go through to impact. Does anybody believe on that one? There is one person there. Tell us, do you have, I think I need to pass a microphone to you. Tell me why.
Just simple. It's because it's too complicated for corporations now. If we move forward from ESG to impact, it's okay to speak like this? Yeah, okay. Yeah, just because the reason is it's too much complicated for corporations if you move forward from ESG to impact, because we are in the current stage that we still have not very good disclosure on ESG, especially in Asian countries. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So there are still areas of work, current countries, some jurisdictions where it's still ESG is considered enough. We don't have all the data that we would need to go through to impact. Are there any other views on this? Any other views on this? Yes, please. Let me come around.
Hi, thank you. I'd say they're two sides of the same coin. As an investment asset manager, I need to look at ESG as the bedrock, but then I need that impact intentionality, which you're talking about. So for me, they're undividable.
Okay, so indivisible. Just take a view here, please. Yes, response.
Yeah, I think just Nathan had started to talk to this, and I really want to sort of drill down into this topic. I think ESG is a framework, and if you look at the paper in which ESG was first mentioned back in 2004, it's a paper called Who Cares Wins. Environmental, social, and governance were described as three pillars within which a company's performance could be measured. What I think the pushback, and those pillars, by the way, are all linked to impact in some way. So to the lady's point over there, they are two sides of the same coin. It's not like you're doing ESG now and then you're going to do impact in the future. I think where we're tripping up is actually there has been a pushback against ESG ratings. Now, the paper Who Cares Wins didn't say you should compile all of those three into a subjective and opaque score and then allocate a AA or AAA rating to it and put it in your sustainable investment fund. They didn't say that. And that's, I think, where we're seeing a lot of the pushback is ESG ratings, which have dominated the financial sector over the last decade, we're seeing their twilight years now for good reason. It's because they're based on very subjective and relative methodologies that in the light of regulation now, SFDR, CSRD, and a view of double materiality, they don't hold muster. And so I think it's really, really important to know that ESG, the framework, should survive and can survive and will be relevant until the end of time. But ESG, the product, i.e. ESG ratings, is on its way out.
Thank you. Could I just give one other question about, are we ready for impact? Is in SMEs, in small and medium-sized companies. Who would like to? You're smiling very hard.
Yeah, so I am blessed to look after our SME work here at CDP, and we've just launched a new questionnaire this year, which is admittedly probably more geared towards medium-sized enterprises. And I think the challenge is how do you express that impact measurement and reporting? Because the challenge for SMEs is just the scope and scale of what ESG reporting has become. And we know that you need to have a significantly pared down reporting route, focusing on proportionality and appropriateness for an SME. Does an SME need to report 200 pages of environmental reporting? Well, maybe. But maybe they don't. And I think we need to have a real conversation about what that appropriateness is. And hopefully CDP's on the right track of introducing a really pared down route, but we know we've got a lot of work to do. So I'd say probably we need to move on with the big corporates. But you're right, it is two sides of the same coin. So it depends how it's expressed, because if it is a different expression of the same metrics we're already looking to collect from SMEs, well then yes, we are ready. But it really depends on what's going to underpin that impact measurement, because SMEs have such a challenge to meet the sustainability reporting standards of large corporates. And if you say, oh, just use GHG protocol, greenhouse gas protocol, to assess your emissions, well, there's a step in between to go, well, how do I apply this to my business and my unique business characteristics from a generalized principle? And I don't have money to pay consultants to do it for me. So there's this bridging gap in capacity for SMEs that accentuates everything. And I think any shift towards impact needs to be wary of that. But you need to be aware of the capacity gap anyway as it relates to ESG reporting. So if you can bridge straight to impact, it saves a job of going ESG and then on to impact. So I think there needs to be a harmonization and an understanding and a coming together of what really matters and what do we want to measure and report, and then cascade that onto SMEs, rather than have them go through this iterative journey that large corporates have gone from from impact back to ESG, and then potentially back to impact measurement.
Certainly with the scope 1, 2, 3 approach, the idea was that, as you went down a value chain, right at the top, you have many factors that you've got to report on. By the time you get down to, I don't know, a mango farmer in the global south, you would expect what you've probably got: fertilizer, water, transport. That's all you should be reporting. That's not what's happening. Many large companies are putting the entirety of their system onto SMEs, and that is a big problem. So thinking of big problems, there is a backlash going on. A backlash in the UK and US, EU. What's going wrong? James?
It's interesting. I think from a systems thinking perspective, typically, systems don't just sort of change gradually and sort of, they do change slowly, and then all of a sudden. And I think often, when the sign of this backlash could in some terms be evidence of the success of the agenda of moving beyond just a very narrow sort of short-term profit maximization view of business. So the current system pushing back with this level of ferocity is in some ways perhaps a sign that actually we're on the cusp of some really, really big transformation. So in some ways it could be seen as a sign of success. On the other hand, maybe the backlash will be successful. The idea that we're going to act with the urgency and depth in the next 5 years that's required to make a hopeful, livable future possible is not a given. Maybe this backlash will muddy the waters, will create doubt. So again, from a systems change perspective, one of the key things to do is to work with both activating and resisting forces. And a lot of our work with businesses currently is to really help people to sort of think through the resistance that they're going to face. And I think, if you are working in sustainability, we really need to be upping our game around the business case that we're making and just making clear that, impact and ESG is just good business. So I think particularly focusing on value at risk and value to gain. I think many businesses have a very sort of, are a bit asleep actually around the level of value that's at risk. So I think particularly using applied futures tool to sort of wake them up to that. But in terms of the value to gain as well, I think often the value to gain isn't always that tangible. Things like cost savings are often the low-hanging fruit that's already been taken. And I think really, looking at things like innovation, market shaping, disruption, customer preference, employee preference, things like that, making sure that we're getting better at sort of telling that story and winning that argument.
Thank you. And I'm going to jump to Mahima. In terms of, if this is a backlash, maybe it's a political backlash, in which case that's really quite tricky. But if it's actually about, people's lives, families, communities, and so on, and that, this is pressing really hard on us on climate change, what kind of solutions would you be suggesting?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think some of the solution lies in framing the environmental challenge better. I think we've done a really poor job of communicating the fact that when we're saying save the environment and track your carbon emissions and manage your water, it's not because of the environment's sake, it's actually for us. We're doing it for human well-being. And again, that's where impact valuation builds that very clear bridge between what it looks like just a list of data points to actually what is the cost to a human being in terms of health costs as a result of air pollution. Air pollution is only a bad because someone's gotten sick as a result of that company releasing air pollution. So if you can quantify that in the language of human beings and start to express that, you suddenly have a different narrative. And I think we've done a poor job to date communicating the fact that all environmental issues are people issues. I think we need to be better. And actually, we're delighted to be working now with companies, as large as Ørsted on people-powered and people-positive energy and renewable energy, all the way down to SMEs who recognize that in order to stay in operating in their communities, they need to look not just for their business interests, but actually look out for the community. And so we're seeing solutions across the board, and including with investors who are looking across their portfolios to start to identify like where are the hotspots really where we need to drill down in terms of natural capital impact and human capital impact and start to understand all the way down to the company level what's happening there, and therefore where can we intervene either through advocacy or divesting or engagement or something in between. So there are lots of really positive pockets out there of good news stories and ways in which we're incorporating social into environmental, but I think there's a lot more work we can do on that front.
So with that you're really saying that the solutions require us to consider people alongside climate. Now, Nathan, your organization was climate. Tell us about that then.
Yeah, well, social's a little bit of a tricky subject for CDP. For those who aren't aware, we've been laser focused on the E for environment of ESG. And I think increasingly as you get to the stages we're talking about here, looking at deep decarbonization, deep supply chain action, there are inevitable social issues that do rear their heads, most significantly, of course, this concept known as the just transition, not just transitioning away from carbon-intensive activities, but doing it in the right way that doesn't have social impacts. And, that's an issue we're grappling with at the moment here at CDP, looking at just transition. We have looked at just transition in previous years through our ACT program, assessing the low carbon transition, which did look at just transition explicitly. But, CDP disclosure itself to date has been very focused on the E. And I think that's a journey we need to explore to understand what elements of ES do we need to bring in to make sure we're actually covering the E properly looking forwards. And, there are some elements that lend themselves to this already. Supply chain action and engagement necessitates this social element. TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, already mentioned, necessitates some social action as well. So I think we will start to see some movement further on this for CDP at large. But really crucially, our City, States and Regions program has already been looking at people and planet. We released a report around that, and a majority of our city, states and regions were taking action, that climate-related action that benefited people as well. And I think that really lends itself when you think about that program of work with its very localized context and localized focus being looking at cities, states and regions as the actors rather than perhaps multinational corporates. They're very located in their society. And I think that's going to be a really crucial area to focus on as we expand. And then lastly, I just want to build on, as you mentioned, SMEs. As we bring SMEs into the fore of CDP disclosure, I think that's another area where this social element's going to be key. Because you're right, and they all come at, they all is too sweeping. A vast majority that I've spoken to all come at the environment side through a social justice lens, and they are looking to take action that doesn't just benefit them inwards, but has a positive impact on the local community and brings them with them on the journey. And 9 times out of 10, they'll favor a more difficult solution that has these additional benefits for their local community rather than the simpler, neater solution that that might be more inwardly facing. So it's a bit of a journey for CDP overall, but thankfully there's a lot of really great examples of this already in practice, and indeed impact investors are helping lead this charge, and there's a fund in particular that springs to mind, the And Green Fund, which explicitly will only give finance to entities that are looking to do projects with people and planet as the cornerstone of their action, hence the name And Green. It needs to include that people element, otherwise you're not getting any finance out of them. So there's a bit of a tension there for CDP, but we do recognize the importance of that social side and are looking at where do we need to evolve for the future.
Thank you. Elsa, if I can come to you on this, people and planet, could technology solve this challenge between considering people issues and planet?
I'm not sure technology can do that. But you asked about Asia earlier, and I'd like to share some of that perspective. So we do have pressing problems, especially on the people side, right? Both are actually competing. They're always competing. There's always going to be compromises. And just give you an example, as wealthy as everything Hong Kong is, we still have a huge population living in poverty, right? So people living in 100 square feet or less. So there's a pressing problem for housing to be solved. So at one point, our former chief executive was proposing a land reclamation for a few 100,000 of housing projects. But then the Greenpeace people came out immediately protesting against that, saying the dolphins are going to be killed as a consequence. So, of course, it's an argument, it's a controversy whether we take care of the current generation first or we look after the next generation. And at the same time, I think a lot of the ESG issue or people or planet being politicized, like, EV, for example, right? So lots of batteries and nickels are coming out from Asia. And Indonesia were burning down trees and deforesting for nickel battery factories to be built. So one can argue, yeah, we can live without EVs, and then waiting for the perfect solution to come along. And the Indonesians can continue to live in poverty without a job, right? So there's always going to be an argument between the both. So I'm a little bit more on the pessimistic side, but I think we need to all work together. The world needs to work together without much politics involved once we get into this kind of topics, so that we can last to the next.
Thank you, and some really powerful words there, and in particular, this issue about, what problems do you solve now? What problems do you solve later? And that is certainly a consideration. So I'm going to come back to you last, Ben. Has any of this discussion, any of the issues that we've talked about, has it changed your investment approaches in the last few years? The move towards impact and so on?
So the strategies that we and our team work on are very much dedicated specifically and intentionally and entirely to impact. So those strategies, whether they're social and environmental in nature, or whether they're specifically focusing on climate or health or social inclusion, those are dedicated impact strategies. And I think we've absolutely sort of learned over the course of that 6 or 7 years, how to do it better. We started off with a framework that focused on the balance between high quality businesses, but also strong intention and purpose and measurable intentional outcomes, or positive outcomes on social and environmental issues. But we've learned as we've gone along, and we've learned to sort of focus on specific data points that help us understand and evaluate whether the company we're investing in is having the intended impact. And actually it moves us a little bit away from the very broad gathering of ESG data, however important I agree that is, to really focus in on the one or two metrics, like we were saying earlier, that indicate whether this company is going to be successful in tackling climate change or bringing people into the digital economy or tackling major intractable health issues, etc., or dealing with waste through a circular economy system and approach. So I think we've learned as we're doing. That's our approach in our team. But what is, I think, really encouraging and interesting at somewhere like M&G is that the practices that we've learned from others and developed within our team are now being more broadly applied across the more mainstream funds at M&G. And I think that's absolutely critical to not just have these pockets of high impact strategies that to me and my team run, but actually bring that into common practice. And I think the idea of impact accounting, for example, or more of a nature-oriented evaluation of impacts on natural ecosystems of our investments and the reliance of all our investments in the economy on natural ecosystems, I think that is a really positive move that is positive but also absolutely necessary if we're going to scale up the solutions and the practices that will put us in a better position to deal with the future economy and deal with the challenges we face.
That's a nice finish. Thank you, Ben. But we do have a little bit of time for Q&A. So please, if you've got a question for our wonderful panel here, please do put your hand up. Otherwise, I'm going to put, yes, please.
Hi, thank you so much for the information. Okay. We talk a little bit about SMEs, inclusion under the disclosures. I was wondering, what do you think about the transition economies and also emerging economies? Because what we are talking, even it's high for the corporate companies to obey. And I think it's really important to also think about the position of the transition economies. Can you have information about, or can you give some advice?
I mean, it's, we're on a journey with regard to SMEs. As I mentioned, we're kind of at the starting point, having launched this year. I know in my gut, in my heart, that this is fundamentally more geared towards medium-sized enterprises. Within that, we've then got a journey to scale down to small and micro. As you kind of point out, that's already potentially 5 to 10 data points. So, even within the developed economy view of CDP disclosure, they're just launching it. There's a long runway then to think about developing and transition. There's a lot of work ahead of us on SMEs, and that's what we're critically assessing right now. My colleague in the audience has actually been researching our way forward on some of these thornier elements, because we know what we have at the moment. It's not fit for purpose for, say, a micro entity of, one person and another. It's not fit for purpose for, transitioning economies, developing economies, where there is an even further gap to bridge. So we're looking at partnerships. We're looking at what the capacity building needs are, what the data requirements will be, engaging with stakeholders to say, what do you really need to understand about these entities, and really trying to tackle it from both the top down, what do the stakeholders want, and the bottom up of what is possible to be able to be provided. But long story short, I've got no silver bullets for you here. It's a journey we're on at CDP, and one we know we've got to get right, and we know that's going to necessitate a very tailored approach, and it can't be a Western-centric, big corporate-led, top-down approach. It has to be fed from both sides and meet in the middle, but it's a hell of a challenge.
Mahima, I think you had a...
Yeah, I should just want to build on what you're saying, Nathan. We should probably talk later, but I have... maybe a bullet. I don't know if it's a silver bullet, but we actually have a tool called SME 360X, which helps SMEs start on their impact measurement journey with almost no data. And we rely heavily on estimates. To your point, Elsa, I think it's really important to acknowledge that we're never going to operate in a perfect data environment, but we can estimate data. And so that tool becomes both a get on the reporting journey type tool, but also an engagement and an educational tool to get SMEs aware of, okay, I need to collect my electricity bills and input these. I need to get my water bills and input these. If I'm a farmer, I probably don't need either of those. I just need my amount of fertilizer that I'm using. And I think there's two narratives that I think are tricky right now when it comes to SMEs. I hear time and again in the market that, oh, there's a huge reporting burden on SMEs, and we shouldn't, we should not bother with them in the sustainability transition. And I think actually that's extremely patronizing. And what doubles down on the amount of patronizing is that people say SMEs in developing countries, don't have the skills or the wherewithal to get on board. And I think we've actually worked with SMEs in India and Africa and South America, and they are more plugged in and more naturally inclined to operate, with a sustainability lens because of the point you made earlier. They're connected to their communities. They understand that impact is localized impact. Apart from greenhouse gas emissions, all other impacts are location specific. So I think, there is a lot that we can do with SMEs. We do have a tool. We can chat later.
Thank you. Really helpful.
We should chat about that tool too.
Yeah. I think we need to be careful as well. I understand your question is about sort of transition economies and more the global south. And I think we need to be careful that we don't sort of stereotype the global south as just having SMEs. I was recently in our office in India, and there's incredibly, powerful, massive global businesses that are headquartered in India and other places across the global south. So, obviously there's a climate justice lens, and here in the global north, business here needs to be stepping up and doing much, much more. But we don't have the time. We've got 5 years where we need to cut our emissions at least in half for a hopeful, livable future to be possible. We need everyone, and most of the world's population, is in the global south. And I think there's something about, this isn't just this will be better for their economies. This, we don't have time to wait for businesses in the global south to take the long, meandering road that we've taken and the slow road we've taken in the global north. We really need them to be leapfrogging to much, much more effective, much, much more impactful approaches. And I think, things like the recent legislation that we're seeing coming through from the EU, a lot of, exporting businesses are really quickly catching on to what's needed. I was recently doing some work with a huge apparel manufacturing business in Sri Lanka, and hearing the way that they talk about social issues was streets ahead of many of the conversations that I hear happening in boardrooms here in London. So I think it's also, we need to be careful to sort of not somehow think that just because a business is in the global south that they're somehow backward or behind. Often I find the conversation is at a much higher level in some of those businesses than businesses here.
So it's just as important, but it may be quite different, and it should be. I think I'm going to have a hand waving just in a minute for somebody to say we're finished. Oh, we have one person here. That's good. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing some great insights on the panel. Just a quick question with respect to institutional investors. Given the fact that the global pensions industry is worth around 60 trillion, what steps, in your mind, can be taken to try and increase that flow of capital into aspects like blended finance, obviously marrying of concessionary capital together with private markets investors to try and facilitate a greater return? How can we motivate pension funds and institutional investors into blended finance, for example? Thanks.
Have a go with Ben. Yes.
Should I add a quick comment? I think first of all, it is these are sort of early stage, relatively embryonic mechanisms that I think the financial services industry is really kind of learning how to use and how to employ. So building internal skills at organisations such as pension funds, institutional investors, and fund managers is the critical step. I think but kind of getting going. So we at M&G we made an acquisition of a EM-focused impact organisation called Responsibility 2 or 3 years ago, which has brought some super interesting, important, valuable impact skills into our business, very much focused on blended finance. So they've got a long history at a relatively small scale of using blending to work with development finance institutions, work with the public sector, work with kind of societal goals, frankly, but bringing institutional capital to play to try and scale up the solutions to tackle these big problems. And I think the point would be that we are now building those skills into M&G at a much larger scale. Now, many of our other peers in banks and fund managers across Europe and North America are doing the same thing. And I think it's really about upskilling and bringing in those resources and skills, but it's also about partnerships and sort of being open to discussion with development finance institutions, with the public sector, and working together to try and allocate capital towards those solutions. So I think it's happening slowly, needs to accelerate.
Thank you very much, and I'm being asked, I'm afraid, that we need to finish at this point. So thank you for your questions. Thanks also for our wonderful panelists, James, Nathan, Mahima, Elsa, and Ben. Just one quick thing. For all of you, are your savings, your pensions in sustainability or impact? Just hands, including our panel. It's less than half. It's less than half. It is still quite difficult as an individual to do this, but it's changing quite rapidly. And almost all of pension funds in the UK now are making that switch. Thank you, all of you. Thanks for the audience, and I hope this has been useful for you all. Thank you.